In the spring, people in the northern hemisphere gather in one way or another to express their affection for these warmer days and the green trees and the beautiful grass as it's coming out. But for Christians, Easter is not just a cultural festival celebrating spring. Easter is a time to celebrate the life of Jesus, described in the New Testament Gospels. Now, this is a typical Bible, like the kind that many people have in their homes. And it was given to me by my Aunt Letha, who was a Southern Baptist, on the occasion of my ordination, and she had my name imprinted here. And it's got wonderful gold paint on the sides that make it really shiny and pretty. And it's indexed. It has I don't think this is leather. If it's a kind of a fake leather cover, it's really, and the pages are really thin so they can get the whole Bible in a fairly compact way. Very special. And in here are the Gospels in the New Testament that tell the story of the life of Jesus. And I was given this as a reminder that my Aunt Letha was a strong Southern Baptist and believed what was in here was really the truth. And I loved her very much for giving this to me. But I already knew, because I had gone to school, that what was in here wasn't exactly the truth. It's more of an imaginary story. I found out when I went to school that the original Gospels were not written at the time that Jesus was walking the earth. They were written about 70 to 125 years later. Let's imagine 70 years ago, something happened. Let's see, would that be 1950, around the time I was born? And people told stories about it, but then somebody finally said, well, let's write down what happened in 1953. And that was the only record kept. And then somebody else said, well, they didn't get that quite right. So it's 90 years now. Let's write down what happened and what we remember in the stories we heard. And then 125 years, the Gospel of John was written, 125 years after the birth of Jesus. And so they wrote this down. Now, Jesus spoke Aramaic, but they wrote it down in Greek. So already there's a translation from languages and there's a translation from history. But then they wrote this on papyrus, which doesn't hold up very well, and it starts to deteriorate and fall apart. So all those early copies of the history of Jesus' life on earth, they all fell to dust. We have one fragment, and we can see the slide there. The oldest gospel fragment, still in existence, is created 125 years after Jesus was born. And actually, it's in the John Ryan's library in Manchester, England. And I was lucky enough that Unitarian College in Manchester invited me to come over for a few days to talk with them. And I was lucky enough to go to the library and actually see this fragment under glass, the oldest copy of anything about Jesus that we have in the whole world. Well, so people would notice that the books are falling apart, and scribes would come along and handwrite new versions. And we don't know whether they added things or took things out. We think they did. So you're copying along, you say, well, this is an interesting story, but I know a better story, so maybe I'll just add that. Or here's, I heard a saying the other day, a wisdom saying that really is important in my life, so I'll just add that as I'm writing along and recopying the Gospels. We just don't know what happened. But these Gospels were copied over and over again for hundreds of years. And then, eventually, one of them survived, two of them survived, 350 years after Jesus was born. And we can go to the next slide. They're copying the Gospels. This is a recently discovered photograph of a monk working away. So about 100, almost 200 years ago, scholars began to say, let's go out and investigate. Let's go to the Middle East and go to the monasteries and see if we can find some old manuscripts that are still around, that we can actually see if we can get the earliest Gospels. Maybe we can find one that was written really close to after Jesus died on the cross. So one man, a German from Leipzig, who was a biblical scholar and an archaeologist, went in 1844 to St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, Egypt, at the foot of Mount Sinai. And this man he's a young man who was just fascinated with this whole subject. I don't know if he wore a hat quite like this, but he rode on camels to get there. It was not easy to get there. And then he arrived and he looked around, and they had a library with all these old manuscripts. And he was sitting in the library one day looking at stuff, and he noticed that there was a basket in the library. And I wasn't able to get any ancient papyrus today, but just imagine that this is ancient papyrus. And he said to the librarian, "What are you going to do with all that stuff in the basket?" And he says, "Oh, we're taking the old stuff out of the library and we use it to start the fire in to heat the monastery." And the German scholar said, "Do you mind if I just kind of look at this?" He says, "Oh, we're going to burn it anyway." "Sure, you can have it." So he took it to his room and he looked at it and he discovered that these were very ancient manuscripts with the New Testament written in them. And he took them back to Leipzig, where they still are today in the library there in Germany. Well, he got very excited about this. He wanted to see other things. He was just, said to the librarian, "This is really wonderful stuff. You shouldn't burn this. This is so great." And the librarian thought, he's getting really excited. Maybe the stuff we have is valuable. And he wouldn't let him see anything else. Don't get too excited if you're working with a librarian who doesn't know what he really has. Well, he went back 9 years later. He went down for Germany, back to the St. Catherine's Monastery, and he stayed there for several days exploring the library, and he was disappointed. He didn't really find anything, and they wouldn't really give him access to stuff. But this was a persistent biblical archaeologist, and he went back again in 1859. And by then, I think there was a kind of a shift in the library management. He again looked around in the library. He couldn't find anything really significant, very old manuscripts. It's got to be the last day. It was in February. And he was walking in the garden out there with one of the monks, talking about Greek manuscripts of the Bible. And the monk said, "You want to come back to my room for a minute and have a cup of tea?" And they went back into the room, and then the monk went into a corner, and he had a manuscript all wrapped up, something like cloth. And there's a lot of interference that day on the microphone. And then he unwrapped it, and he looked at it and discovered it didn't look exactly like this, but a book, an ancient book that had the oldest copy of the Bible in existence. And let me use this microphone from the pulpit. That'll work better. So, he got very excited. They let him take the manuscript back to his room. He couldn't sleep all night. This Greek Bible that he had, he got to look through 1859, all of this wonderful information about Jesus and the entire Old Testament and New Testament, and he estimated it was created about 350 years after Jesus' death, which makes it the oldest complete manuscript of the Bible. And according to the German archaeologists, Bible archaeologists, they gave him permission to take it back to Europe. Today they would say it was stolen, but he did get a receipt. And he took it, his research was sponsored by Tsar Nicholas Alexander II in Russia, who lived in St. Petersburg. So he took it to St. Petersburg, and it was kept in the Library of St. Petersburg, the National Library of Russia. And the Tsar sent about 7,000 rubles to the monastery as payment for this manuscript, the oldest biblical manuscript in existence. The earliest information we have about the life of Jesus that's complete. Well, of course, there was a revolution in 1917 in Russia, and the communists took control, and Stalin didn't really care that much about New Testament scholarship or the Bible, but he did have funding problems for his new country. So he sold the biblical manuscript to the British Library for £100,000, which would be roughly $8 or $9 million today. And there was actually a campaign in London and in England to raise the money to buy the manuscript, and it was taken to the British Library. I was very excited when I went to England for the first time in 1981 to go to the British Library and see the world's oldest Bible. I thought there would be a crowd around it, but actually nobody was paying any attention but me. But still, this manuscript, this amazing manuscript, was right there in the British Library, and you can go see it today if you want to. Biblical archaeology. It's so exciting to imagine that we can somehow touch what people in the past have done. But what do we really know about Jesus after we gather all this information together? Not very much about his real life. The experts say things like, we know that he lived. Some people doubt this, but it's pretty confident that he actually lived. We know that he was probably baptized by John the Baptist, because that appears in several sources. We know that over a period of 1 to 3 years, the timing is not quite clear, he walked around the countryside talking about restoring the Jewish religion, debating the Jewish authorities who were in power. We know that he was crucified by the Roman leader, Pontius Pilate, and the experts agree that the story of him coming back to life after he was executed was invented by his followers after death and didn't really happen. That's about all we're certain of. But when I've gone as far as I can learning about the historic facts about the life of Jesus, there's another step to take. As I would with any other story, I look at the writings of the New Testament in terms of my own experience of life, especially on a Christian holy day such as Easter. I ask myself, do the parables in the Bible, do they enrich my life? Do the wisdom sayings offer useful advice on my own day-to-day living? Can the example of Jesus' life serve as a model for me? And when I'm finished gathering the facts, the minimal facts that we can gather, in the end, the value of the Gospels depends on whether the words give meaning to my life. And for me, the answer is yes. When I read, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, I learn about the difficulties of social action. When I read, to him who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, I learn about the nature of nonviolence. When I read, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, I learn about the nature of love. When I read, where your treasure is, there will be your heart also, I learn about the danger of greed. When I read, how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye, I learn about the nature of counseling. When I read, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves, I learn about the nature of the potential evil within us, including certain politicians who are false prophets. So early in the spring, at Easter, people in the Northern Hemisphere gathered to celebrate the amazing green trees, the colorful flowers that appear, the fresh green sprouts, the sounds of the birds, the squirrels playing in the trees, the daily increase in warm sunlight. And many gather on this Sunday to express their affection for the teachings of Jesus. Each year I give thanks for the beauty of spring, and I join with Christians in celebrating the fact that Jesus' stories, Jesus' sayings, have survived over 2,000 years and given guidance to millions of people around the world.